Today, we'll be joined by a best-selling author who happens to be the bestseller of bestsellers with his debut collection, The School for Good and Evil, selling more than 3 million copies. Welcome Soman Chainani as he's here to discuss his amazing new book, Beast and Beauty. How you doing today?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm pretty good. New York's still in 90-degree summer weather, so I'm kind of in my element.
It's a beautiful day today. It's nice. One of the things that I thought about as I was reading your amazing new book, I'm so happy to have it early, is how has being in the pandemic affected you creatively? Were you able to write as like business as usual, or did you kind of take a step back?
Such a good question, because I think every writer has handled it differently. I had a very specific set of circumstances, which was I finished the last of the School for Good and Evil books on March 11th of last year. I turned in the final draft that was going off to press. It was the sixth in a series. It was a 10-year journey. And that was supposed to sort of end the phase of my life. I had planned to take the rest of the year off, and I was going to go to a tennis academy in France and basically just go on a kind of like an Australian walkabout and find new energy and inspiration for something new. And then lockdown happened 48 hours later. So I went from, just almost retiring as a writer and thinking that I was going to have a year where I wasn't going to write, to suddenly being trapped, in a small space. And I think, in those days, it'll be very hard for us to go back and actually remember what that headspace was like when the pandemic started, of how sort of doomsday and apocalyptic everything felt. And I remember thinking that now, if any time, was the best time to write. And I had to find a way to put my feelings into something. And it almost felt like the world had gone wrong. Like we had made a wrong turn and somehow inflicted this upon ourselves, And I thought, look, I write fairy tales. That's what I do. So why don't I go back to the originals, the original Grimm stories, and just redo them and teach the right lessons this time, as if we could do the whole world over again from the 1600s or 1700s from when they were written. And it was such a big challenge, but it filled my time during the pandemic of, all right, I'm going to redo them as if I was the Brothers Grimm. And that really gave me the energy and the inspiration to get through lockdown.
Well, congratulations on one of the wildest books I've ever read. Like, I thought it was funny. I thought it was dark. I thought it was brilliant. And it kind of left me wondering, what was your relationship to some of these tales anyway? Like, did you come up on the Brothers Grimm tales, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think my relationship was similar to what most Americans' relationship with these stories, which is I learned them from Disney, right? And so you grow up with the Disney versions of the fairy tales, and the Disney versions are completely wrong. And the Disney versions are contorted so that the good guy always wins. And so you grow up with this very kind of skewed sense of good and evil and moral and immoral. And I think it's so bad for us and kind of toxic in the way that we learn our fairy tales that it ultimately extends all the way to our politics, right? There's the good guys and the bad guys, and either you're with the good or you're with the evil. And like, there's no shades of in between. There's no nuance. There's no understanding of balance, that sometimes you have to let the other side win in order for your side to have meaning and things like that. And the Grimm stories, that's what all of those were about. They were the survival guides to life back then. So when I went to college, I ended up in a fairy tale seminar where I learned the original stories. And I was like, oh my God, my entire life was based on this ridiculous lie, of these Disney stories. So I think that gap, the fact that I felt I was lied to as a child, is what caused my obsession with fairy tales and this desire to undisneyfy people's brains, whether they're kids or adults. Just get the Disney fairy tales out of their heads.
Yeah, I was like, one of the things that made me laugh, I was like, he made Snow White black.
It's funny, Snow White, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Though I wrote this fairy tale collection in order. All the stories I wrote precisely in the order that I wrote them, except for Snow White. Snow White, I think I did 4. And I remember thinking, like, what am I going to do with Snow White? Who wants to read about Snow White? No one. And then I thought, well, that's the joke. The joke is that you have an all-white kingdom where, the only black woman in the kingdom is who the prince marries, because the prince is, so sort of in love with himself that he wants to bring the one black woman into his fold. And then, of course, kind of, treats her poorly. And so when she has a daughter, she names her Snow White, almost as an ironic kind of jab at this kingdom where Black beauty is not recognized or acknowledged or understood. And I grew up, it's funny, it's a personal story in a lot of ways, because I grew up on an island where I was the only brown kid, right? I was the only kid who looked like me. And I remember that feeling very well. And so I wanted a fairy tale to be about that, to be about difference.
While reading your book, I was thinking about when I read The Three Little Bears to my daughter a couple of months ago, and I was laughing because I was like, yo, this white lady's out of control. She went inside of somebody's house. She tried to porridge. She lounged on the couch. She slept in the bed. She probably took a dump. Like, she did all of these things. And then these bears are coming home like, yo, I literally just made the bed. It's wrinkled. I literally just put this soup out, and somebody, Goldilocks is out here eating other people's food in a pandemic. Like, I was like, yo, it's so gross.
100%. Goldilocks really represents, there's a lot of depth to that story, and I think I reference it in Snow White, because when I have Snow White come to the dwarf's house, she basically does the same thing. She pours herself a glass of wine, makes the salad, does all these things. And ultimately, the dwarves are like, now you have to do something for us in return. And what they want more than anything else in the whole world, because the dwarves are Black too, is they want stories that have characters that look like them. It's the one thing that's missing, right? So, I think the Goldilocks story is interesting because it really is the story of a girl who kind of takes whatever she wants and runs, And in this case, I wanted to do a story where the bears, in a way, have their revenge, or at least the bears get their say.
Do you feel like there are people who, because I always thought it was funny. I was saying that I haven't seen privilege exercise, in the way in which Goldilocks did since I've, really realized the whole hustle behind Batman. And instead of how he couldn't take his money to clean up the city, he's like, no, I'm gonna buy gadgets and go fight, and be a vigilante. Are there people who push back?
People push back on that, you mean of that representation?
People push back on the classics being remixed.
I think what ends up happening is, every fairy tale, I think, has to speak to something universal. It has to feel like it taps into something that you've seen or because the whole purpose of these to begin with, they were meant to teach you a lesson about life that you would take forward. And so I think the key about how to write these stories is to always look for, something that would feel universal to everybody. Even though Snow White is, the only Black girl in the kingdom, it doesn't mean that only Black people reading that story are going to understand it. It means that anybody who has felt that sort of bitterness of difference and not being acknowledged and understood because there's a different stereotype or a different model of what beauty is or what intelligence is or whatever it is, right, is going to recognize themselves in that story, So I think, the key is to be able to push past that resistance and find the universality of each tale.
One of the things I really appreciated about your book was just this whole idea of how the Brothers Grimm they just got it wrong. And so many of these things that we subscribe to, so many books and so many lessons and things that are just forced on us as young people are just not right. And I think it's I think it's difficult for a lot of people to latch on to that at times, but I think you do a great job at pushing the conversation forward.
Well, I think sometimes what you have to do in a story is actually identify where people have been brainwashed or gone wrong. So The Little Mermaid is a key example, right? So the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, she gets her happy ending at the end, she goes off with her prince, all these things. But that story makes no sense because Ariel is clearly the villain of that story, right? She's the one who disobeys her family. She's the one who falls in love with the prince even though she knows nothing about him. She's the one who goes to her father's worst enemy, the Sea Witch, and makes this deal. She's the one who signed the contract and then somehow has a problem with it later. She's the one who consistently is the villain, right? And so when I wrote my version of The Little Mermaid, I just wanted it to be a conversation between, the Ursula character and the Ariel character, where Ursula is like, I am not the problem. You are the problem. right? And let's be very clear, you are the villain in this story, and have them actually argue that out. Who's good, who's evil in this story, right? And so I think sometimes it just takes having someone point out that the story doesn't make sense. I even think of The Lion King. Lion King makes no sense because Scar is set up from the beginning of that story as a character who doesn't fight, right? He's skinny, he's afraid of fighting, he will never fight you, right? He's so unwilling to fight Mufasa that he waits until Mufasa has a child, like for years, until Simba grows up so that so Scar can use Simba to kill his own dad, right? So at the end of the movie, Disney has a problem because they need Simba to beat Scar and win the movie. But Simba's not good at anything. Simba's not very smart. He's not clever. He's not funny. He doesn't have he's nothing, no good qualities on the side, right? So what do? They have them fight. They have Scar fight Simba, which makes no sense because the entire movie is about how Scar doesn't fight and gets other people to fight for him.
Two non-fighters fighting.
Yeah, so it made me crazy because I'm like, you're just cheating. So my job as a writer is to point these things out and find a way to kind of undo it.
Yeah, maybe they could have cut in a scene where Simba got a gym membership and maybe hit the heavy bag or something like that.
or something where Scar, I don't know. I just think, the whole point of Scar is that he doesn't fight. So it was disappointing that movie ends in one.
I feel like representation definitely plays a major part in your work, and it's something that you should be championing for because we need that. Was the lack of diversity that exists, was that something that kind of got you into the way you write children's literature?
100%. I mean, I think it's funny because with The School for Good and Evil, 10 years ago, if you were an author of color, you had to write about white characters. I mean, that was your only way into the industry, if you were going to write a big fantasy. And so I kept thinking, what I wanted to do was take those Disney characters that we thought we knew, the blonde prince, the sort of dark featured witch, the blonde princess, and take them and sort of completely dismantle them, right? And then as the years went on, I was able to sort of pump those stories with so much diversity, characters from all different backgrounds, different sexualities, different, ways of thinking and modes of being and all those kinds of things. And I was able to do that as sort of like a reparative to the Disney upbringing, and also even Harry Potter, right? Because Harry Potter is so straight and so white. And with Beast and Beauty, I was able to really from the ground up be like, okay, this is gonna reflect the world, right? So every story takes on, some element of not necessarily diversity in the world, but a version of representation in the world that we haven't really seen in a fairy tale. So Sleeping Beauty is about a prince, not a princess. Beauty and the Beast is about an Asian family that immigrates to France, and they're trying to make a business, even though there's quite a bit of racism against them there. So every story is sort of finds an angle to redo a familiar tale in a different way.
As a person of color, you found success in the publishing industry, which is historically very white. Do you feel like things are finally changing for the better?
I think so. I think what's happening is, luckily publishing is filled with smart people. You know what I mean? Because it's books. So that's where you're going to find the smartest souls in the world in a lot of ways. And I think they caught on to it quite early that if you didn't have books that reflected a larger experience, then you were sort of shortchanging the world, and you were also losing money because you weren't serving a large part of the audience. And because of that, I think you've seen a lot more books published that represent a wider range of experience. And at the same time, that's what feeds movies and TV, because movies and TV these days are often based on books. So you're expanding your repertoire of what stories we're going to be able to see. For me personally, I have so many different facets to my identity, right? Because I'm Indian, but I'm American, but I'm also gay, but I grew up an athlete. Like, there's just so many different pieces to play with. And so I think in a lot of ways, I don't seek out to do sort of like gratuitous representation for any sort of moralizing or sake or anything like that. I just seek out to represent different shades of myself, which tend to be universal because they fit other people's identities as well.
That would be like a wow, like one liner and like a quick bio. It's like, I am an Indian American gay athletic writer who.
I remember, like, it just, yeah, it's almost too many things sometimes where there's just a lot of different pieces. And I just have to remind myself that it's not just me, it's everybody, right? You go to everybody and you try to get them to sort of boil down their identity, and they realize that there's so many contradicting pieces, and people are complicated, and we forget that. And I think, especially when I write characters, I feel like I need that sort of level of complexity because that's who we all are. We don't always make sense.
No, we're blessed to have you writing because we need that. Like, we need someone who can draw from those many different experiences just so we can learn too. That's kind of what it's about. And congratulations on The School for Good and Evil being made to a series on Netflix.
Oh, it's going to be a movie. Yeah,
A
it's
movie
a
on
movie that
Netflix,
comes out sometime next year. We haven't sort of specified a release date quite yet.
Are you allowed to talk about it yet?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely talk about it. I was on set for a while earlier this spring. It was shooting in Belfast. It finished shooting on, I think it was July 29th is when I think it finally, or July 19th, something like that. And it's being directed by Paul Feig, who's one of my favorite directors, and is just the best. He made Bridesmaids and Ghostbusters and A Simple Favor, and was the creator of Freaks and Geeks and Spy. He's awesome. And so it stars a whole laundry list of big names on the adult side and some fantastic young actors. On the young actor side, you have Sophia Wiley, who's a big star, and Sophia Ann Caruso. And then on the adult side, you have Charlize Theron, Kerry Washington, Lawrence Fishburne, Michelle Yeoh, amongst others. So it's just an absolutely fabulous cast that Paul has put together. The movie looks absolutely insanely incredible. It's one of the biggest movies Netflix really has ever made. So I'm just excited for the world to see it, and get to see the book on screen. It's not Harry Potter, let's put it that way. It's a whole new kind of fantasy school, very representative of the world. Every shade of the rainbow, every shade of color. It's just so much more diverse than what you got from Potter.
Film is so collaborative. So when we write these books, you get to work on it. You just a conversation between you and your editor that goes out to the world. When you make these books into films, you have to include so many people, and you have to watch your work be picked at and picked at and picked at and picked at. And did that bother you any?
No, because I think I was lucky in that I came from the film world. I went to film school, after college, and that's where I started as a screenwriter and as a director. So it was what my training was. And so in a lot of ways, when I went to write the novel, I almost wrote it with a filmic adaptation or a filmic mind, because was my training. So I think it made it easier to sort of write the screenplay because it was already based in a 3-act structure. And I think, I was involved so much all along because it had a long, sort of complicated development process. And if anything, I think the running joke is that I always pushed for more changes than everybody else. Anytime I had my hands on it, I was moving things around, messing things up, because that's what I love to do, is sort of like break structure and things like that. And, then they would always put it back to the way it was in the book. So I feel like the final result is very, very faithful to the books, and yet has its own kind of cinematic unity and wholeness to it, So I just think we were lucky to have someone of Paul's caliber do this, because it elevates it from, just sort of a run-of-the-mill fantasy movie into an event movie for all audiences.
Should we be looking forward to Beast and Beauty coming to the silver screen as well?
I think Beast and Beauty will make a killer TV series, almost like a Black Mirror, where every episode is its own fairy tale. So that's my dream for it. We're early in the process, but that's the hope, that it would be a sort of beautiful, awesome TV series.
I feel like you're gonna make it happen. Please tell everyone where they can get the book.
They can get the book anywhere. It's available at every sort of retail store you can imagine. But if you go to evernever.com, which is my sort of big umbrella fantasy website, evernever.com, you can get links to signed editions that are available from multiple bookstores. And you can find me on Instagram at Soman C or Twitter at Soman Chainani. But evernever.com is sort of my big home for the fantasy universe.
Thank you for coming on. This is great.
Thanks so much for having me.